The shuttle landed with a heavy thud on the palace landing pad, its engine smoking from the long journey across 3 star systems. Chancellor Voss stood at the viewing window of his private chamber, watching as his soldiers dragged their prize from the cargo hold. The human looked smaller than he expected, not much different from the other weak species they had conquered over the decades. Krath stood behind his master, silent as always. The massive warrior had served as the Chancellor's personal bodyguard for 30 years, and in all that time he had never failed to protect what mattered most. His 4 arms hung loose at his sides, but every muscle in his obsidian body remained ready for action. The Chancellor trusted no one else with his life, and for good reason. "So, this is what all the fuss is about?" Voss said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had crushed 1,000 worlds. "One human researcher who thinks he can defy the hegemony." The prisoner walked between the guards without struggling, his hands bound behind his back. He was older than most captives they brought in, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. But something about the way he carried himself caught Krath's attention. Most prisoners cowered or raged when they arrived at the palace. This one simply observed everything around him with the calm focus of a scientist studying a new specimen. Dr. Marcus Webb had been captured after his research station finally fell to the hegemony forces. The siege had lasted 6 months, far longer than anyone thought possible. A single human facility had held out against an entire battle fleet, using tactics that made no sense to military experts. When they finally broke through the defenses, they found Webb in his laboratory, calmly destroying his research rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The Chancellor had been curious about this defiance. Every species they conquered followed the same pattern: initial resistance, then fear, then submission. The strong survived by serving the hegemony, while the weak simply died. But humans seemed different. They fought with a desperate fury that bordered on madness, refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain. "Bring him to the interrogation chamber," Voss ordered. "I want to understand what makes these creatures so stubborn." Krath followed. As the guards escorted Webb through the palace corridors, the human walked steadily, his head turning slightly as he took in every detail of his surroundings. Most prisoners spent their time in terror, but Webb seemed to be memorizing the layout of the building. It was a subtle thing, but Krath noticed it. In his line of work, noticing subtle things kept people alive. The interrogation chamber was a stark white room with a single chair in the center. Webb sat when ordered, his posture straight despite the restraints. Chancellor Voss entered with his usual dramatic flair, robes flowing as he took his position behind the questioning table. "Dr. Marcus Webb," Voss began, reading from a datapad. "Age 57, xenobiology specialist, former professor at Earth Colonial University. Your research station was supposed to fall in 6 days. Instead, you held out for 6 months. How?" Webb looked up at the Chancellor with steady eyes. "We had something worth protecting." "Your research? Your data? Your people?" Voss leaned forward. "What could possibly be worth dying for?" "Hope," Webb said simply. The Chancellor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Hope? That's what you call it. I call it stupidity. Your people are dead. Your research is destroyed. Your colonies are burning. What hope is there left?" "The hope that someone, somewhere, will remember that we tried," Webb replied. "That we chose to stand up instead of kneel down." Krath found himself studying the human more carefully. There was no bravado in his words, no desperate defiance. Webb spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made peace with his fate. It was unusual, and unusual things made Krath nervous. The interrogation continued for hours. Voss demanded technical details about human defensive systems, information about colony locations, intelligence about military capabilities. Webb answered some questions with scientific precision and ignored others completely. When pressed about classified information, he simply said he didn't know, and somehow made it sound believable. "You're trying my patience, human," Voss said. "Finally, perhaps you don't understand your situation. You are alone, far from home, at the mercy of beings who could crush you like an insect." Your species means nothing to us? Your life means nothing to us. Then why are you asking so many questions? Webb asked. The simple logic of the response caught the Chancellor off guard. Krath almost smiled at his master's moment of confusion, but maintained his stoic expression. The human had a point. If they truly meant nothing, why spend so much time trying to understand them? Because, Voss said slowly, I want to know what makes you tick. What drives a species to fight battles they cannot win? What makes you so different from every other race we've conquered? Webb was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. We're not different, he said finally. We're just honest about what we are. We know we're weak compared to you. We know we're going to lose. But we also know that how we lose matters. It matters to us, and it matters to our children, and it matters to anyone who comes after us. Your children are dead, Voss said cruelly. Your colonies are ash, your resistance is broken. Maybe, Webb agreed, but the idea survives. The idea that beings can choose to be something better than what they are. That's what you're really afraid of, isn't it? Not our weapons or our ships or our defenses. You're afraid of the idea that strength doesn't have to mean cruelty. The Chancellor's face darkened with rage. Guards! Take this fool to the detention level. I'm done with him for today. As the soldiers moved to escort Webb away, Krath noticed something that made him pause. The human turned his head slightly and made eye contact with him for just a moment. There was no fear in those eyes, no plea for mercy. Instead, there was something that looked almost like understanding. As if Webb had seen something in the massive bodyguard that others missed. The moment passed quickly, but it stayed with Krath. As he followed his master back to the private chambers, the Chancellor was already planning the human's eventual execution, discussing various methods with his advisors. But Krath found himself thinking about Webb's words, about the idea that how someone loses matters as much as winning. It was a strange thought for a professional killer to have, and Krath wasn't sure what to make of it. But something about the human had been different from other prisoners. Something that made him want to understand more about what drove a species to fight hopeless battles with such determination. The palace settled into its evening routine, but Krath's mind remained active. For the first time in 30 years of service, he found himself curious about a prisoner. It was a dangerous curiosity, the kind that could get a bodyguard killed if he wasn't careful, but as he stood guard outside the Chancellor's chambers, Krath couldn't shake the feeling that his world had just become a little more complicated. 3 days after his capture, Webb made his first escape attempt. Krath found him in the ventilation system above the detention level, having somehow picked the lock on his cell using a piece of bent metal from his food tray. The human had made it almost to the main air recycling plant before the sensors detected him. Impressive, Krath said as he pulled Webb from the ductwork. But foolish. Webb looked up at his captor without shame. Had to try. My daughter would never forgive me if I didn't at least try. The mention of family caught Krath's attention. Most prisoners babbled about their loved ones when captured, begging for mercy or making desperate promises. But Webb spoke of his daughter the way a warrior spoke of honor, as something that demanded certain actions regardless of consequence. Your daughter is on Earth? Krath asked as he escorted Webb back to his cell. Last I heard. She's studying medicine, wants to help people. Webb's voice carried a pride that seemed unaffected by his current situation. She's probably worried sick about me, but she knows I'm doing what I have to do. Krath secured the cell door and checked the locking mechanism. What you have to do is stay alive. Escape attempts will only anger the Chancellor. Maybe, but sitting still makes me feel like I'm giving up, and I can't do that. Webb settled onto his narrow bunk and looked up at Krath. You understand, don't you, about doing what you have to do? The question was simple, but it carried weight. Krath had spent 30 years doing what he had to do, following orders without question. But Webb's tone suggested he saw something deeper. In the massive bodyguard, something that made him worth talking to as more than just a guard. I understand duty, Krath said carefully. So do I. Mine just looks different from yours. The second escape attempt came a week later. Webb had somehow fashioned a small explosive device from cleaning chemicals, using it to blow a hole in the wall of his cell during the night shift change. He made it to the palace kitchen before being recaptured, and when asked why he had gone there instead of toward the exits, he simply said he was hungry. Krath knew better. The kitchen was staffed by servants from conquered species, beings who might have been sympathetic to a fellow prisoner. Webb hadn't been looking for food, he had been looking for allies. "You're studying us," Krath said as he brought Webb back. "TO detention. Learning our routines, our weaknesses, our people." "I'm a scientist," Webb replied. "It's what I do." "And what have you learned?" Webb was quiet for a moment as they walked through the corridors. "I've learned that most of the people in this palace are just trying to survive. That they follow orders because they're scared, not because they want to hurt anyone. And I've learned that fear makes people do things they hate." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Krath had seen it countless times over the years. Good people forced to do terrible things because they were afraid of what would happen if they refused. The hegemony ran on fear, and fear was a powerful motivator. "Fear keeps order," Krath said, but the words felt hollow as he spoke them. "Fear keeps people quiet," Webb corrected. "But it doesn't keep them loyal. There's a difference." The third escape attempt was the most ambitious. Webb had spent 2 weeks carefully observing the guard rotations, mapping the palace's security systems by listening to the sounds of machinery in the walls. He had befriended several servants, learning fragments of their languages and earning their trust with small acts of kindness. When he finally made his move, Webb didn't head for the exits. Instead, he went to the servant quarters, where he helped 3 young beings from different species escape through a service tunnel he had discovered. He was caught trying to go back for more. "Why?" Krath asked as he found Webb in the tunnel, covered in dust and exhaustion. "You could have escaped. You had a clear path to freedom." Webb looked up at him with those steady eyes, "Because leaving others behind isn't freedom. It's just another kind of prison." The Chancellor was furious about the escape attempts, but instead of executing Webb immediately, he decided to use him as an example. He ordered the servants who had helped Webb to be brought to the main courtyard, where they would be punished publicly. Krath watched as Webb was forced to witness the beatings, his face pale but determined. The human didn't beg or plead. Instead, he spoke quietly to the servants in their own languages, offering what comfort he could. When one of them, a young being barely out of childhood, began to cry from fear, Webb started singing. The song was soft and gentle, something from Earth that spoke of safety and love. Krath didn't understand the words, but he felt the emotion behind them. The melody was simple, the kind of thing a parent might sing to a frightened child, and slowly, impossibly, it began to calm the prisoners. "Stop that noise," the Chancellor ordered. Webb kept singing. "I said stop." The human's voice grew stronger, and the other prisoners began to find courage in the simple melody. They stood straighter, their fear giving way to something else. Not defiance exactly, but dignity. Krath found himself listening to the song and feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. It was a warmth in his chest, a reminder of what it felt like to protect rather than intimidate. The feeling was dangerous, but he couldn't make himself look away. "You will watch them suffer," the Chancellor told Webb, "and you will know that. Their pain is your fault for defying me." Webb finished his song and looked up at Voss with calm eyes. "Their pain is your choice, not mine. I'm just showing them they don't have to face it alone." The beatings continued, but something had changed. The servants endured their punishment with quiet strength, drawing comfort from the human's presence. Webb himself never looked away, accepting responsibility for their suffering while refusing to regret his actions. When it was over, the Chancellor leaned close to Webb's ear. "Tomorrow I will bring in more prisoners, and the next day more still. How many will you let suffer for your pride?" "All of them," Webb said quietly. "If that's what it takes to show them that someone cares." That night, Krath found himself unable to sleep. He stood at his post outside the Chancellor's chambers, but his mind was in the detention level, thinking about a human who would rather watch others suffer than abandon his principles. It was the kind of stubborn nobility that got people killed. in the hegemony, but it was also the kind of nobility that Krath had once believed in, long before 30 years of service had taught him to value survival over honor. The human song echoed in his memory, a reminder of what it felt like to be something more than just a weapon. For the first time in decades, Krath found himself questioning whether strength and cruelty were really the same thing. Webb had shown more courage in 3 weeks than most warriors showed in a lifetime, and he had done it without hurting anyone. The thought was dangerous, but it wouldn't leave him alone. As the palace settled into sleep around him, Krath wondered what his life might have been like if he had learned to be strong in the way Webb was strong. If he had learned to protect rather than destroy. It was too late for such thoughts, of course. He was what he was, and the Chancellor owned his loyalty. But still, the song lingered in his mind, a gentle melody that spoke of possibilities he had never considered. In the detention level below, Webb sat in his cell and planned his next escape attempt. Not for himself, but for the others who would be brought in tomorrow, because that's what humans did. They tried, even when trying was hopeless. And in the darkness of the palace, a bodyguard stood guard and wondered what it would feel like to be worth singing about. The Chancellor's patience ran out after Webb's fourth escape attempt. This time, the human had managed to send a message to the outside using a maintenance drone he had somehow reprogrammed. The message was simple but damaging, detailed information about the palace's defensive systems and guard rotations. "Bring him to the medical wing," Voss ordered. "I want to know how his mind works. Perhaps we can learn something useful before I have him executed." Krath felt something cold settle in his stomach as he escorted Webb to the medical bay. The Chancellor's curiosity had taken a darker turn, and the human would suffer for it. The medical wing was where they conducted experiments on captured specimens, trying to understand what made different species tick. Dr. Nash, the head scientist, was waiting with his instruments. The pale, thin being had conducted thousands of such experiments over the years, always in the name of advancing the hegemony's knowledge. His methods were precise, clinical, and utterly without mercy. "Fascinating," Nash said as he examined Webb like a laboratory specimen. "The human physiology is remarkably similar to several other species we've studied, but their psychological structure seems quite different." Webb was strapped to an examination table, unable to move but still alert. He watched the preparations with the same scientific curiosity he had shown since his capture. Even facing torture, he remained interested in learning. "What makes you so stubborn?" Nash asked as he prepared his first test. "Every species has a breaking point. What's yours?" "I don't know," Webb replied honestly. "I guess we'll find out together." The first session lasted 4 hours. Nash subjected Webb to various forms of pain and stress, monitoring his responses and taking detailed notes. The human endured without breaking, answering some questions truthfully and refusing to answer others. When asked about military secrets, he simply said he didn't have access to that information. Krath stood guard during the session, watching the proceedings with growing discomfort. This was different from his usual duties. He was used to violence. That served a purpose, but this felt like cruelty for its own sake. "Interesting," Nash said as he reviewed his data. "The human's pain tolerance is actually quite average, but his psychological resistance is remarkable. He seems to be drawing strength from something external." "What do you mean?" the Chancellor asked. "He's not enduring this for himself. He's enduring it for others. Every time the pain becomes overwhelming, he speaks about his daughter, his students, his people. He's using their memory as a source of strength." Webb lay still on the table, breathing heavily but still conscious. When Nash asked him about this observation, he smiled weakly. "It's not about being strong. It's about being connected. When you care about something bigger than yourself, you can handle more than you think." The sessions continued for days. Nash tried different approaches, different methods of breaking the human's will. But Webb remained unbroken, drawing strength from sources the scientists couldn't understand or measure. During one session, Webb began talking about his work on the research station. He described the team he had worked with, beings from 6 different species who had learned to cooperate despite their differences. He spoke of breakthrough discoveries they had made together, advances in science that could have benefited everyone. "We were so close to a universal translator," Webb said during a break between tests, "a device that could let any species communicate with any other. Think about what that could mean for peace, for understanding." Nash dismissed the idea. Communication leads to conflict. "It's better for species to remain separate, with the strong ruling the weak. Is that really what you believe?" Webb asked. "Or is that just what you tell yourself to justify the experiments?" The question caught Nash off guard. For a moment, his clinical detachment slipped, and Krath saw something like doubt in the scientist's eyes. But the moment passed, and Nash returned to his work. As the days passed, Krath found himself spending more time in the medical wing than duty strictly required. He told himself he was ensuring the prisoner's security, but the truth was more complicated. Webb's conversations during the sessions had become educational in ways Krath hadn't expected. The human spoke of Earth, of cities where millions of beings lived together in relative harmony. He described art and music, literature and philosophy. He talked about scientific discoveries that had improved life for everyone, and about how cooperation had allowed humanity to spread across the stars. "Your species sounds weak," Krath said during one of their conversations. "All that cooperation, all that caring for others. In the galaxy we live in, weakness gets you killed." "Maybe," Webb agreed, "but it also gets you friends. And friends are worth more than fear in the long run. Friends betray you when it serves their interests. Some do. But real friends, the ones worth having, they stick with you even when it costs them something." Webb looked up at Krath with those steady eyes. "You know what real friendship looks like?" "I can see it in you." The observation was uncomfortable because it was true. Krath had once known friendship, loyalty that went beyond duty or fear. But that was long ago, before the hegemony, before 30 years of service had taught him to trust only in strength. The breakthrough came during the third week of experiments. Nash had been trying to understand how Webb maintained his mental resistance, and he finally thought he had found the key. The human's brain activity showed unusual patterns when he spoke about his loved ones, suggesting that his memories were actually providing him with measurable psychological strength. "Remarkable," Nash said as he studied the readings. "The human is literally drawing power from his emotional connections. It's as if his brain has developed a resistance to despair based on his attachment to others. Can you break it?" The Chancellor asked. "Perhaps. If we can convince him that his loved ones are dead, that his sacrifice is meaningless, the resistance should collapse." The plan was simple and cruel. They would bring in prisoners who claimed to be from Earth, who would tell Webb that his daughter was dead, that his homeworld had fallen, that his resistance had accomplished nothing. The psychological shock should be enough to break his will, but when they brought in the false prisoners, Webb saw through the deception immediately. He looked at the beings who were supposed to be his fellow humans and shook his head sadly. "Nice try," he said, "but humans don't stand like that. And they sure don't speak with that accent." The Chancellor was furious at the failure, but Nash was fascinated. "How did you know?" "Same way you'd know if someone was impersonating your species, little things, subtle things. But more than that, I know my people. I know what they're capable of, and I know they're still fighting. How can you be so certain?" Webb smiled despite his pain, "Because I raised some of them. And I know what I taught them about never giving up." That night, as Krath stood guard outside the medical wing, he heard something that made him pause. Webb was singing again, the same gentle song he had sung in the courtyard. But this time he was singing it for himself, drawing comfort from the melody in the darkness. The song was about hope, about connections that couldn't be broken by distance or time. It was about love that endured even when everything else fell apart. And as Krath listened, he began to understand something that the Chancellor and Nash had missed. Webb wasn't strong because he was human. He was strong because he was connected to something larger than himself. He had people who counted on him, people who had learned from him, people who would carry on his values even if he died. That knowledge gave him a kind of immortality that No amount of pain could touch. For the first time in 30 years, Krath wondered what it would feel like to be connected to something like that, to be part of something that mattered beyond immediate survival. The thought was dangerous, but it wouldn't leave him alone. In the medical wing, Webb continued his quiet song, and Krath found himself humming along under his breath. He didn't know the words, but he understood the melody. It was the sound of hope refusing to die, of love that transcended all barriers, and in that moment, something began to change in the heart of the hegemony's most feared enforcer. The first sign of trouble came through the palace's communication system. Reports of coordinated attacks on hegemony facilities across 3 sectors, all using tactics that military analysts described as unconventional and highly adaptive. The rebel forces were learning, evolving their strategies in ways that suggested new leadership. Chancellor Voss studied the reports with growing anger. These attacks show human influence. Somehow, our prisoner has been communicating with the outside. Nash shook his head. Impossible. We've monitored every moment of his captivity. He's had no contact with rebel forces. Then how do you explain this? Voss gestured at the tactical displays. These are human strategies. Patient, methodical, designed to maximize damage while minimizing casualties. It's exactly what we would expect from their military doctrine. Krath stood silently behind his master, but his mind was working. The attacks did show human influence, but not in the way the Chancellor assumed. Webb hadn't been sending messages to the rebels. He had been teaching everyone around him, from fellow prisoners to palace servants to the guards who watched him. His lessons in hope and resistance had spread through the palace like a virus. Bring him to the throne room, Voss ordered. I want answers. Webb was dragged from the medical wing, weak from weeks of experiments but still alert. He looked around. The massive throne room with the same scientific curiosity he had shown since his capture, taking in the details of the Chancellor's seat of power. You've been busy, Voss said, gesturing at the tactical displays. Your people are learning new tricks. They're not my people, Webb replied. They're their own people. I just showed them that they didn't have to be afraid. You showed them how to die uselessly. I showed them how to live meaningfully. Webb's voice was weak but steady. There's a difference. The Chancellor's rage was building, but before he could respond, an aide rushed into the throne room with urgent news. The palace's outer defenses had been breached. A small force of rebels had somehow penetrated the security perimeter and were fighting their way toward the main building. Impossible, Voss said. No one has ever successfully assaulted this palace. They're using our own defensive systems against us, the aide reported. They seem to know exactly where our weak points are. Krath felt a chill of understanding. The rebels weren't just using human tactics. They were using specific knowledge about the palace's defenses, information that could only have come from someone who had studied the building in detail. Someone like Webb. You, Voss said, turning to Webb. You mapped our defenses during your escape attempts. You've been feeding information to the rebels. I've been doing my job, Webb replied. A scientist observes and learns. What others do. With that knowledge is up to them. The Chancellor drew his personal weapon, a plasma pistol that could kill most beings with a single shot. You will contact your rebels and order them to surrender, or I will execute every prisoner in this palace. Webb looked at the weapon without fear. I can't contact them. And even if I could, they wouldn't listen. They've learned to think for themselves. Then you're useless to me. Voss raised the pistol, aiming at Webb's head. The palace shook as an explosion rocked the outer walls. The rebels had brought heavy weapons, and they were using them with precision. Somewhere in the distance, alarms were sounding as the hegemony's defenses began to crumble. You're too late, Webb said calmly. Whatever happens to me, the idea has already spread. You can't kill an idea with bullets. Voss's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the throne room doors burst open. A group of palace servants ran in, carrying improvised weapons and wearing expressions of desperate courage. They had been inspired by Webb's example to finally stand up to their oppressors. Protect the prisoner, one of them shouted. Don't. Let them kill him. The servants were untrained and outnumbered, but they fought with a fury that surprised everyone. They weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting for the right to choose their own fate, just as Webb had taught them. Krath watched the chaos unfold, his massive form perfectly still. The Chancellor was screaming orders. Palace guards were fighting desperate servants, and Webb was trying to shield others from the violence, despite his own weakness. In the middle of it all, a small child from one of the servant families cowered. In terror, the child had been caught in the crossfire, too frightened to move. A palace guard raised his weapon to strike the small being down, seeing only another rebel to eliminate. The blow would have killed the child instantly. Webb saw it happening and moved without thinking. Despite his wounds and restraints, he threw himself between the guard and the child, taking the blow meant for the innocent. The impact sent him sprawling, but the child was safe. "No," the child cried, rushing to Webb's side. "Don't hurt him. He's good." The simple declaration cut through the chaos like a blade. Here was a being who had never known anything but fear and oppression, and yet they recognized goodness when they saw it. They were willing to risk their life for someone who had shown them kindness. Kr felt something break inside his chest. For 30 years, he had served the hegemony by instilling fear in others. But this human, this weak and wounded prisoner, had inspired love instead. Even facing death, Webb's first instinct was to protect an innocent. The Chancellor saw his opportunity. While Webb was down and vulnerable, Voss aimed his pistol at the human's back. "This ends now." But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Krath moved. His massive hand closed around the Chancellor's wrist with crushing force, stopping the shot before it could be fired. "No," Krath said, his voice carrying 30 years of suppressed conscience. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone in the throne room froze, staring at the impossible sight of the Chancellor's own bodyguard defying him. "What did you say?" Voss demanded, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "I said no." Krath's grip tightened, and the Chancellor's weapon clattered to the floor. 30 years I've served you. 30 years I've followed your orders without question, but this is wrong. You swore an oath to protect me, I swore an oath to serve the hegemony. But this isn't service. This is just cruelty. Krath looked down at Webb, who was struggling to his feet despite his injuries. He's shown me what real strength looks like. It's not about making others afraid, it's about making them hope. The Chancellor tried to pull free, but Krath's grip was unbreakable. You're making a mistake. I am your master. You are my master? Krath corrected. But masters who rule through fear don't deserve loyalty, they only deserve pity. Voss reached for a backup weapon with his free hand, but Krath was faster. The blow was quick and precise, delivered with the skill of 30 years of training. The Chancellor fell without a sound. His reign of terror ended by the bodyguard who had once been his most faithful servant. The throne room fell silent except for the distant sounds of battle. Everyone stared at Krath, waiting to see what the massive warrior would do next. He had just killed the most powerful being in the galaxy, and no one knew what came after that. Webb struggled to his feet, supported by the child he had protected. He looked up at Krath with those steady eyes, and for the first time since his capture, he smiled. Thank you, he said simply. Krath nodded, feeling strangely light despite the weight of what he had done. Thank you for showing me what I was meant to be. The palace shook again as the rebels broke through the inner defenses. Soon, they would reach the throne room, and Krath would have to decide whether to fight them or join them. But for now, he was content to stand guard over a wounded human who had taught him that true strength came from protecting others, not destroying them. The revolution had begun, and it started with a single word, no. Outside, the battle raged on. But inside the throne room, something new was being born. An alliance between former enemies, united by the understanding that some things were worth more than victory. Love was worth more than fear. Hope was worth more than power, and sometimes the deadliest bodyguard in the galaxy was exactly what the cause of freedom needed most. The palace fell within hours, but the real war was just beginning. News of Chancellor Voss's death spread across the galaxy like wildfire. triggering massive retaliation from hegemony forces. Fleet Admiral Drex, the Chancellor's most ruthless military commander, declared martial law and vowed to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. Webb sat in what had once been the Chancellor's private medical bay, receiving treatment for his wounds. The rebel medics worked carefully, their hands gentle as they repaired weeks of damage. Krath stood nearby, no longer a guard but not yet quite a friend, watching over the human who had changed everything. "The fleet will be here within 3 days," reported Commander Lin, the rebel leader who had organized the palace assault. "Drex is bringing everything he has. We estimate 200 ships, maybe more." Webb nodded thoughtfully. "What do we have?" 37 vessels, mostly converted. Cargo ships, a few military escorts we captured." Lin's expression was grim. "We're outnumbered 6-1 and outgunned even worse." "Then we don't fight them ship to ship," Webb said. "We fight them the way humans fight. We use their strengths against them." Kraft listened as Webb outlined a strategy that seemed impossible. Instead of fleeing or preparing for a siege, the rebels would scatter throughout the palace and surrounding city, using the civilian population as cover. They would turn the hegemony's own tactics against them, making every building a potential fortress and every citizen a potential ally. "It's suicide," one of the rebel officers said. "The fleet will just bombard us from orbit." "Not if we have hostages," Webb replied. "Not if we have something they want more than victory." The plan was audacious beyond belief. The rebels would take control of the palace's communication systems and broadcast throughout the galaxy, showing the universe what the hegemony really was. They would expose the atrocities, the experiments, the systematic oppression of countless species. Most importantly, they would offer hope to anyone willing to stand up and fight. "Information is the most powerful weapon we have," Webb explained to the assembled rebel leaders. "The hegemony rules through fear because most beings don't know. They have a choice. Once they see that resistance is possible, that freedom is achievable, everything changes." Krath found himself becoming Webb's closest advisor, his knowledge of hegemony military tactics proving invaluable. The massive warrior had spent 3 decades studying the enemy's weaknesses, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. Now that knowledge served a different master. "Drex will try to end this quickly," Krath told the planning committee. "He'll want to make an example of us, to show other worlds what happens when you rebel, but he's arrogant. He thinks strength is always the answer, and it's not," asked Commander Lin. "Not always. Sometimes strength is knowing when not to fight." Krath looked at Webb, who was studying tactical displays despite his exhaustion. "The human taught me that." The broadcasts began immediately. Using the palace's powerful communication array, the rebels sent messages to every corner of the galaxy. They showed footage of the experiments, recordings of the Chancellor's cruelty, testimonies from freed prisoners. But most importantly, they showed hope. Webb himself appeared in many of the broadcasts, his calm voice explaining that freedom was possible, that beings didn't have to live in fear. He spoke of cooperation between species, of the advances that could be made when different kinds of minds worked together. He painted a picture of a galaxy where diversity was strength, not weakness. "You don't have to be human to be free," he said in one broadcast. "You just have to be willing to try. And if you try, you won't be alone. We're all in this together." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Uprisings began on dozens of worlds as beings who had lived in fear for generations suddenly found the courage to stand up. The hegemony's communication networks were flooded with messages of support, offers of aid, and declarations of independence. Admiral Drex arrived at the palace system 3 days later, just as predicted. His fleet was massive, a collection of warships that could have destroyed entire star systems. But instead of the quick victory he expected, he found something that confused him. The rebels weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were broadcasting. "Surrender immediately," Drex transmitted. "To the palace. You have 1 hour to lay down your weapons before we begin orbital bombardment." Webb's response was calm and measured. "We're not going to surrender. But we're also not going to fight you the way you expect. We're going to show the galaxy who you really are. The broadcast continued even as the fleet took position. Cameras throughout the palace showed the rebels preparing for battle, but also caring for wounded prisoners, protecting civilians, and working together despite their different species. The contrast with hegemony brutality was stark and deliberate. "You're making a mistake," Drex warned. "I have enough firepower to glass this entire planet." "Yes, you do," Webb agreed. "The question is whether you're willing to commit genocide on live galactic television, because that's what everyone will see. The mighty hegemony, so afraid of a few rebels that they're willing to murder millions of innocents?" The Admiral hesitated. He had built his career on swift, decisive action, but this was different. Every move he made would be watched by billions of beings across the galaxy. Every decision would be judged by history. "You're using the civilians as human shields?" Drex accused. "We're showing them what freedom looks like," Webb replied. "They're not shields. They're partners. And they're willing to stand with us because they've seen what the alternative is." The siege began, but it was unlike anything in military history. The hegemony forces landed troops and began a careful, methodical assault on the palace. But every battle was broadcast, every atrocity documented, every act of cruelty exposed to the watching galaxy. Krath fought beside Webb, his massive form protecting the human as they moved through the palace corridors. But this wasn't the mindless violence of his past. This was purposeful, defensive, designed to protect rather than destroy. "Stay close," Krath told Webb as they helped evacuate civilians from a damaged section of the palace. "Drex's troops are getting desperate." "Let them be desperate," Webb replied, supporting an injured child as they moved. "Desperate people make mistakes." The mistakes came quickly. Frustrated by the rebels' unconventional tactics, some hegemony units began targeting civilians directly. The atrocities were captured on camera and broadcast immediately, showing the galaxy exactly what the hegemony was willing to do to maintain power. The response was swift and decisive. Neutral governments that had remained silent for decades suddenly found their voices. Trade routes were closed, diplomatic relationships severed, economic sanctions imposed. The hegemony's vast empire began to fracture as member worlds realized they were allied with monsters. Admiral Drex found himself fighting two wars, one against the rebels in the palace, and another against the growing resistance across the galaxy. His forces were being recalled to deal with uprisings on a dozen worlds, leaving him with fewer ships and fewer options. "End this," he demanded in a final transmission to the palace. "Surrender now, and I'll guarantee safe passage for the civilians." Webb considered the offer carefully. The rebels had achieved more than they had dared hope. The galaxy was awakening. The hegemony was crumbling, and the idea of freedom was spreading like wildfire. But the cost had been enormous, and more people would die if the fighting continued. "We'll accept your terms," Webb said finally, "but not surrender. We'll accept a ceasefire, pending negotiations for a permanent peace." "You're not in a position to negotiate," Drex replied. "Look around you, Admiral. Look at your galaxy." "Half. Your fleet is gone, dealing with rebellions you can't control. Your economy is collapsing as worlds refuse to trade with you. Your own people are questioning orders for the first time in generations." Webb's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You're not fighting a few rebels anymore. You're fighting an idea. And ideas can't be killed with guns." The ceasefire was signed on a warm afternoon in the palace gardens, with representatives from dozens of worlds present as witnesses. Admiral Drex, his fleet reduced to a handful of ships, sat across from Webb and Krath at a simple table, signing documents that would reshape the galaxy. "This isn't over," Drex said as he prepared to leave. "The hegemony will return." "Maybe," Webb agreed. "But it won't be the same hegemony. And we won't be the same galaxy." Months later, Webb stood in what had been the Chancellor's throne room, now converted into a classroom. Students from a dozen species sat at desks, learning about cooperation, about science, about the principles that could bind different peoples together in peace. Krath stood at the back of the room, no longer a bodyguard but still a protector. He had found his purpose at last, not in violence but in service to something greater than himself. The students loved him, despite his intimidating appearance, because they could see the gentleness in his actions. The most important lesson, Webb told his class, is that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's moral. Sometimes it's just the courage to say no when someone asks you to do something wrong. A young student raised her hand. What if saying no gets you in trouble? Webb smiled, glancing back at Krath. Then you find friends who will stand with you when trouble comes. Because the best kind of strength isn't something you have alone, it's something you build with others. The lesson continued, but Krath's mind wandered to the future. The galaxy was changing slowly but surely. The hegemony still existed, but it was weakened, challenged, no longer the absolute power it had once been. New alliances were forming, based on cooperation rather than fear. It would take time, maybe generations, to build the kind of galaxy Webb envisioned. But the foundation was there, laid by a human who had refused to give up hope and a bodyguard who had learned that true loyalty meant protecting what was right, not just who was powerful. The revolution had begun with a single word. No, it would continue with a different word. Yes. Yes to cooperation. Yes to hope. Yes to the idea that the galaxy could be better than it was. And, in a classroom that had once been a throne room, the future was being taught by a human who had never learned to surrender and protected by a warrior who had finally learned what was worth fighting for.